Welcome to the Swindon Festival of Literature, or rather the virtual online Swindon Festival of Literature. Thanks very much for joining us, and we do hope that everything is well where you are. We're both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, or at least to go on online. Today's guest author is a researcher, winner of a Darwin Now Award and writer on whaling, but in her latest book, titled How to Be Animal, she takes a close look at both why and the way we distance ourselves from other animal species, how technology influences our sense of our own animal nature and our present and future place on planet Earth. This is her book, with my notes as well there, look, but this is her book. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to today's guest author, Melanie Challenger. Melanie, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, when you say glad to be here, you're almost here. We're online, as people know. Swindon in the spring is lovely. A pity you can't be with us live, but in fact, have you ever been to Swindon?
I have, actually. So I grew up in the sort of Berkshire, Hampshire area, so near Newbury. I went to school in Newbury. And my grandmother grew up in Kingsclear, and my mother-in-law lives in Corsham, in Box sort of Corsham area. So all of that sort of area, including Swindon, which is kind of I know very well. Yeah, and in fact, my grandmother was a kind of really, I can see the flowers in the background, was really obsessive about wildflowers and very much part of those old sort of rural cycles of those parts of the world. So we used to go to all of those sorts of haunts all around the kind of Berkshire, Hampshire, Wiltshire area. So yeah, no, I do know it. It's my yard, as it were.
Well, Melanie, that's really nice. So when COVID and everything is over and you haven't taken 10 years to work on your book as you did on this one, or when you first thought of it. I
can't promise that.
We'll have you live in Swindon.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Yeah, brilliant. Let's get to your book, How to Be Animal, which I find an intriguing title. It raises questions about how close or distant we are from our animal forebears. And there are lots of bits I'd like to quote, but I'm going to start off with a very short bit where you say, in 2010, campaign designers created a series of advertisements for jeans, for trousers, with the title, "We are animals. Man is an animal, but he no longer knows it." Really? Man is an animal, he no longer knows it. Tell us more, Melanie.
Yeah, so the first thing that I tend to say to people, and in fact that I say right in the beginning of the book, is that, and actually I did a talk the other day and I got challenged by the writer Will Self about this, you know, and I work within philosophy and ethics. So again, this is something that I hear a lot. I talk about we in the book quite a bit because one needs a shorthand for being human, you know, and so that collective we is a loving we, for, you know, for all of us. But of course, it is a problem to, you know, argue that we're all the same or that we all experience. And I think the first thing that people think when you make a claim like that we somehow have forgotten that we're animals, or we don't think that we're animals, people will immediately come back and say, you know, for instance, among my biologist colleagues, they'll say, but we're always trying to get people to understand that we're animals, you know, we're biologists, we get this, and so forth. And similarly, I have lots of colleagues, you know, you mentioned my work in whaling, you know, I went up into the Arctic and worked with Inuit hunters in the Arctic, you know, very, very different worldview, very different set of you know, narratives and cultural positionings in terms of how we see ourselves in the rest of nature. So this idea that we don't see ourselves, this claim that we don't sort of really see ourselves as animals, is open to question if it feels like it kind of collapses all of us into, you know, having the same problem. But I think what I try, but I assume all of that, and I think I try to be very thoughtful about all of that. It is very, how we see ourselves. Some people obviously see our relationship to the rest of nature very differently than others, and some cultures through history we have done. Nonetheless, what I try to say in the book is that there is, as really a consequence of our kind of cognition, a struggle inherent in being a human animal, in knowing your animal condition. So that includes lots of things that are threatening. For instance, mortality, we're living it right now, disease, pathogens, dangers, and just the kind of physical, fleshy nature of us, that we've often told ourselves stories that somehow save us from those bits of being animals that we can think about, that we can perceive, that we can imagine because of our kind of cognition, and that we find threatening. And really that's the struggle that I think can be found throughout history and throughout cultures, to try to make sense of what it is to have the kinds of minds that we have, the kinds of experiences that we have, clearly to be organisms and to face threatening things that follow from being animal. And throughout history, people have told themselves different stories. So, the very obvious one is mind-body dualism. So the idea that there's or soul-body dualism, sorry. So the idea, this is the oldest one really that we have, that there's a spiritual part of us, a soul part of us, and that's somehow separate and saves us from all of this animal stuff that we find a bit scary or unpleasant. And certainly that's what will eventually live forever. Someone like Aquinas, for instance, starts to think about what the soul is, and the soul is perceived as this immortal part of humans that will survive our deaths. But later on, we have the idea more that it's our minds that are somehow different and separate. And we sort of live with that still today. So we still live with this idea that human cognition is so exceptional. It's the basis of all of our moral standing. It's enshrined in our legal sort of structures. And somehow it still sort of saves us from all of the troubling and confusing alignment with the rest of nature. So it's big topic stuff, but that's really what I'm talking about. And in that little piece, it's interesting, no one's mentioned that piece from advertising. So this actually comes from within psychology. There's a branch of psychology that has looked at how things like our flesh, our deaths, our bodies, things that we find troubling about being animal, how when we're aware of them, not necessarily thinking of them consciously, but made aware of them, they're made salient to us, how they then influence us. And what they found with that little experiment was that, and this was a real campaign that I think one of the genes companies ran, that if you tell people we're not animals, if you threaten people, if you make people feel agitated, they prefer the story that we're not animals. So they prefer the gene advert that says we aren't animals to the gene advert that says we are animals, particularly if they feel under some sort of existential threat. So that's what that relates to. But yeah, there's lots of interesting research like that that's sort of fairly new, that's been around over the last sort of maybe 20 years, that actually dives down into this aspect of our psychology and what it means to be animal. I was going to read something a little bit different though, so if that's okay, and take this somewhere slightly that I haven't so far, while I've been talking about the book to people, talked about this so much. So I was talking about that sort of dualism, this idea that we're and there's something separate about us. Now the kind of what we call that, you know, is human exceptionalism. I mean, other people might call it anthropocentrism, those sorts of ideas. And this is sort of everywhere at the moment, this idea that we've ended up with a kind of dominant paradigm, really out of modern civilizations, that we are, humans are the dominant and superior form of life on Earth, and we are justified in doing pretty much whatever we want to do. Because we are somehow the only being with meaning. And I think that's one of the things that I look up very closely in the book. So being this struggle that we have with being animal, that part of what I look at is that it's a psychological struggle, that it affects us, and it is useful for us to recognize it, and it can help us to be more at peace with being mortal, with being with the whole life cycle of being human, from you know, the egg right the way through to the corpse, the whole of the life cycle of a human being, which is an animal life cycle. That if we are can be more at peace with it, and sort of situate ourselves more comfortably psychologically with being an animal, that lots of positive things can follow from that. That ultimately telling ourselves stories that just make ourselves feel better but aren't ultimately true about the human condition, don't, you know, we're just running away from the shadow. And actually it's better to face up to it, and to look at all that's beautiful and rich about being an organism and an animal. And I do quite a bit of that in the book, but that's really all about looking at that psychology, about how it affects us, and how we can improve or be more at peace with that within our psychology. But I also spend quite a lot of time in the book looking at the moral and sort of legal implications, or the ideological sort of consequences for this. So right really from the get-go, the idea that there is some superior spiritual non-animal element to being human has always been the basis of what we give ourselves permission to do. So it's always had a moral consequence. So we might think of the religious idea of dominion, for instance. And then when we get through to the Enlightenment, and you get the arrival of ideas that are still with us today, like I mean, not quite, I mean, I'm fudging it, so it's not quite the immediate arrival. I mean, like everything in history, you know, you can see antecedents all over the place, but where it really gets set in stone, the idea, for instance, that our special mental skills, so free will, rationality, reason, dignity, the concept of dignity that sort of flows from these mental attributes, that this is what gives us our special status on the earth. It's where our full moral standing or full moral meaning, you know, comes from. And that's still enshrined today in you know, human rights ideas, in legal personhood, and all of these sorts of ideas rely on this notion that our special capacities as an animal give us full moral status, and all other animals have almost no moral status. And that's always got us into a bit of a pickle, because it's basically taking sort of biological traits and using them for abstract kind of legal and moral systems. But we're not allowed to apply that sort of biological ranking of traits, because, you know, our cognition emerged naturally. It is an incredible skills that, you know, that we have mentally, but there are other incredible skills that other animals have. And yet we sort of don't give any kind of sort of meaning to echolocation, for instance, that a bat might have, or, you know, the sonar skills that cetaceans have. Everything is very biased towards us. So this is the sort of human exceptionalist idea. And I I take that on throughout the whole book. And I don't take that on to say that humans aren't exceptional. I take on the value assumption that comes from human exceptionalism. I argue that ranking biological traits never helps us in any way. In fact, it's led to some of the worst things we've ever done to one another. And it doesn't make sense because evolution isn't a progressive, it doesn't work progressively in that kind of way. And we misunderstand what it is to act compassionately and morally. And so some of the stuff that I do in the book is picking, and I'm going to read this a little bit now, is picking key areas in our lives. So, you know, dealing with the climate crisis, or dealing with, you know, the meaning of human life, where we think our value comes from. I'll pick kind of key areas and show how this strange relationship with being animal that has led to ideas like human exceptionalism just often create more rather than less problems for us. So this, you know, we've got Elon Musk and people like that talking about trying to go to Mars, for instance. So we're sort of messing up the planet. We think, well, we'll go somewhere else. And this is almost seen as a kind of next onward journey for the progress of human evolution. But obviously, because we're animals, you can't go to Mars and somehow cease needing an ecosystem around you. So you're going to have to make an ecosystem. But if you're going over to Mars with this sort of human exceptionalist story in your head, and then it all starts to, all of your sort of neat stories that you've told yourself start to fall apart a bit. So I'm going to read a little section of the book that's called Dreams of Mutants and Mars. And then perhaps, Matt, we can kind of open up into a, you could maybe ask me some questions, or we could open up into a discussion. Imagine this future. It's 2320 and 3 cities have been built on Mars. The people living in this world have taken the genetic material that they most prize from their origin planet and have fused it with synthetic DNA. There's a small forest through which the locals like to walk. There are no biting insects to trouble them. The bears that lumber about in the distance are docile, uninterested. The bees that wing across the bright flowers are stingless. There are no children bickering with each other in a flurry of rivalrous humour. The bees don't need to dance. The humans, if that's what we want to call them, don't need to touch. Nothing has any intention of its own. There is no balance of strategies or intelligences. There isn't any need for other life forms to be intelligent. Evolution is a dirty word. When we consider rebooting life on another planet, we become the creator of a new world. In setting ourselves up as creators, we begin to see the challenges of a new genesis. Why would we be taking life somewhere else? The stock answers to this assume that life generally has a value and that human life has a special value. But the arguments get much blurrier when it comes to the basis of the life. The basis of the value. If life per se is a good thing, then in extending the biosphere by taking life elsewhere, are we adding value to the universe? If it's life that has value, would Mars, a planet that we would people with some life forms, but not those that we dislike, have slightly less value overall than an Earth with all its distinct and sometimes unpleasant interacting elements? With less overall diversity, would evolution on Mars be a lesser version of evolution on Earth? We like to think we're immune to this uncertainty, but any confusion surrounding the value of life more generally is a confusion in what grounds our own sense of meaning. So the point there really is that we sort of blunder on reassuring ourselves that being animal doesn't matter, or telling ourselves stories that reassure us like we're the only animal with value, and we can really steer and control nature to suit our purposes. But what I try to do is myth bust that and get us to see it's much more complicated. We're much more interconnected with life around us, and more fundamentally animal, and that creates difficulties for us that require deep critical thinking, and I don't think we need to do that now because of the impact that we're having on the rest of the earth. So that's also a big part of what I kind of look at within the book.
Melanie, thank you very much. And I'd want to cherry pick topics, and I know we haven't got a lot of time because there's such a range of them in this book. From what you've just mentioned at the end there, you say we're in a period of extinction. I would want to address that. You talk about us having panic attacks like animals. You talk about coronavirus coming from closeness with animals. You talk about reaction to 9/11, a certain animal behavior and a certain non-animal behavior. You talk about how after the Second World War, we tried to escape narrow tribal tendencies. You scatter your book, you pepper it and spice it with literary references from Emily Dickinson, Voltaire, Joseph Conrad. And I could easily have an hour long with you to say science and art. How do the two work together so brilliantly? Because people always try to separate them, but we won't go to that now. What I'd like to ask you about is something that I feel throughout the book, but I want to pin you down to say human beings have for a long time tried not to be animal in the way they behave. In other words, we try not to eat one another. We try not to rape one another. We try to be decent to one another. When somebody says, you're behaving like an animal, it's not a compliment. Yet we sing the praises of dogs. We sing the praises of dolphins. And dogs are loyal and lovely, but they do shit wherever they like, and so on and so forth. So aren't we right to try not to be like animals, but rather refine ourselves away from animals and only bear them in mind as a kind of biological origin?
It's a really good question. So how I I would say that before we started this talking, you and I were just chatting, and you said, sometimes I raise questions I don't necessarily answer. And now publishers like you to answer everything. Policymakers like you to answer everything. But that is not what an intellectual or thinking, activity is all about. Sometimes, and indeed, some aspects of our condition, I think, are, people have been wondering what it means to be human and how we relate morally to the condition of being alive for thousands of years. We still haven't fully answered those questions. They are very, very difficult and gnarly problems and dilemmas that flow for us from being organisms. But to answer that as best as I can at this point in my thinking, within the kind of difficulties for us ultimately stem from the fact that we are moral. So some people are kind of moral nihilists and argue that there are no moral norms. Moral norms are very variable through time, but human beings clearly are moral creatures. They trade in right and wrong. They respond to instantaneously from such a young age to ideas that adults might call justice, but a child wouldn't, but they're still thinking in justice terms. We can see, in sort of moral foundations across all societies throughout history. And you can see it in our bodies. So when we feel that there's been something unfair that's happened, it plays out in our neuroendocrine systems. Human beings are naturally moral beings. So I'm a real moral naturalist in as much as while I understand why we try to systematize morality and we try to build, and rationalize and have our axioms and our claims and our principles and try and work it all like neatly on the page, what is right and wrong. And that seems to exist in a very abstract realm. Ultimately, moral behavior still happens in the body, and it is fundamental to human beings, and it follows from the fact that we are social animals. It's not inevitable that animals are social. lots are, because it solves our problems as organisms in the earth, but humans are highly social. We're socially variable, so and we're group living creatures. And what's very remarkable about human history, I think, and this is an incomplete story yet, we don't know the whole story, but it seems to me, and obviously many others, that our particular kind of moral mind has, and a lot of the things that we see as human is sort of as exceptional about us. So our imaginations, our time traveling minds, our subjective consciousness, and so forth, all follow from the fact that we, you know, are, a lot of what goes on with evolution is that animals must solve problems that follow from the environment, or from a predator, let's say, or from interactions with other organisms, finding food, finding mates, and surviving and staying alive. But human beings ended up solving all of those problems in social groups, but then clearly something happened whereby our social environment became a kind of primary environment of adaptation. So we started really shaping each other. And there is sort of still early work being done on this idea that we domesticated ourselves, that we've gone through a kind of self-domestication process, and we show hallmarks of being, and Darwin clocked this a long time ago, but we're now starting to understand this. People like Richard Wrangham do a lot of really good work on this, Simon Kirby, that you know, we are a kind of self-domesticated creature. And so it's all of those aspects. And so this is all our natural history. This is, you know, this isn't something we've done. We haven't civilized ourselves through ideas. This is something that's happened in our bodies as well. This is, you know, through evolution, rather than just being a function of civilization, modern civilization, for instance. So you would have had kind of moral Pleistocene hunters, just as you would have, you know, a moral, you know, thinker in the Enlightenment. And it's really that sense, that tugging of good out of an amoral world that is a real struggle. And so, you know, I could answer your question, why do we not want to kind of poop in the dirt like dogs do? Well, I mean, because we understand that you know, there are pathogens, because we are trying to avoid, we're still a lot of that stuff still follows from animal stuff. We're avoiding pathogens, we're avoiding dangers, we're avoiding threats to our status, to our bodies. That's still all happening all the time. We may culturally encode it, you know, but it's still following from biological things that make perfect sense, and the animals still try to solve in their own ways. They, you know, animals aren't just blundering around, you know, without a sewage system. They have inbuilt kind of sewage systems. They bury their, you know, their feces, or they, you know, have kind of immune systems that can deal with the pathogen threats that they're most likely to find. So, you know, we don't live in that kind of way. We are culturally evolved animals. We've had gene culture co-evolution. So a lot of the stuff that animals do within their bodies, we now do within our cultures. So none of this is a neat kind of either or thing between kind of humans and other animals. But I think fundamentally, the battle that we have is in making sense of what we want to see as right and good, and how we tug that out of a world in which, as you point out, there are things that just don't seem to be good, like, and we deal with this, I would say, with predation. So we eat other animals. I think it would be a lot easier for us and our moral system if we were herbivores. We're not. We're omnivorous, and we've domesticated our predatory activities so that we have farms now. But we're still predators, you know, we're still we've just domesticated that process. And that always causes a big headache for us, because our moral systems are all alert to doing things, you know, to things that are not nice, and to being empathic and using all of these resources that we have adapted for dealing with these, with how to do good to one another. And yet we know we do things like act as predators that are not nice. And it's really hard to figure out, and Darwin really tried to struggle with this. I remember him saying in one of his texts that, how can you have parasitic good and morality in a world that has parasitic wasps? I don't know why God would make these things. And so I think a lot of what you're talking to really comes from the fact that we're moral animals, and I still think that the full work to be done on understanding what it means to tug morality out of an amoral natural world we haven't fully reconciled with yet.
Absolutely. And one could talk about some very basic things like animals don't shave their armpits. Why do we? Well, you could just say it's something to do with vanity or something, but we seem to be very keen in doing a lot to ourselves, both intellectually, emotionally, and physically, that keep moving us away from the way even very refined animals behave. So it strikes me there's something in us, and I love your last two chapters where you talk about the loveliness of being animal and the intelligence that our bodies already have, if only we listen to it a bit more. And yet there's a great striving. Ooh, there's a spider there. Oh, there's something that wants us to move away from the animal world. I don't know if there's any more to say about that before we go on to something else. Do you want to add anything?
Well, again, I think I think it's always crucial to be alert to the fact that it's very muddled in the human animal. So you mentioned shaving, for instance. Some people would try to say this is just a cultural thing. It's very different from culture to culture, and we end up getting very culturally conditioned. And this is a whole argument, isn't it? That there's this determination to either want to see us as these cultural beings that have kind of that are ultimately invented by our societies and are untouched by sort of any kind of biological that is the nature nurture sort of argument that still rages and drives me absolutely mad today. Because of course nature and nurture are just a big old muddle with each other. They aren't, there's not one dominant thing. I mean, they're just all muddled together. They are the same thing, really, in a lot of ways. We are cultural creatures. We do a lot of learning in our lifetime. That's natural. That's biological for us. That's adaptive. But it means, of course, that you will get social mores and you will get social conditioning, and that you can change and that your views can change in your lifetime. That's part of the wonderful kind of very flexible nature of human experience. But equally well, why do we favor hairlessness as women? Well, it's partly because we look younger, so there are, it won't just be that, but there will also be biological things within there. Sometimes, we're still doing quite biological things like wanting access to smells that we respond to, or wanting to avoid things that are potentially dangerous, like pathogens. But it becomes very sort of culturally encoded and feels like it's something very different, very non-animal, but it's just a human animal thing. It's just the form it takes for a creature like us. And I think we get ourselves into a pickle when we try to neatly separate those things out, because I don't think they can be.
On this question of something topical now, coronavirus, COVID-19, you talk in your book about closeness offers pathways to transmission, closeness both of human beings living together and human beings living close to animals. And you also talk about us being tribal. Again, that's something that animals have. And I wonder if, because there are some societies, you've mentioned different societies around the world have different cultural behavior and so on, who are more cool and detached. Like I've spent quite a bit of time in the Southern Hemisphere, and their hugs and touching and almost kissing to the point of slobbering over one another is quite the norm, and it's an easy thing. whereas the further north you go in the Northern Hemisphere, it's more a kind of detached handshake or something like that. Now, I wonder if something is going on there, some human behavior that recognizes that closeness is pathway to transmission, not only of good things, but also of bad things.
Possibly. To be absolutely honest, this isn't something I've researched, so I'm winging it and speculating with you now, rather than being able to draw on specific research on this. I mean, obviously, yes, there are very different, you know, within societies, often what touch is permissible, you know, will shift through maybe even like the hormonal cycle of females. So, you know, in certain sort of hunter-gatherer communities, you wouldn't touch through the menstruation period, and you know, there are taboos come in place, and there's all sorts of different ways that humans have thought about what you can, you know, in different traditions, from handshakes to nose rubs and so forth. Yeah, of course. But whether or not what has happened across you know, particularly Western Europe, in the kind of very mannered, you know, the stereotype of the mannered distancing has followed ultimately from recognition of pathogen load. My instinct is probably not. I would suspect that, but I don't know. You'd have to. There's almost certainly a book on the history of handshakes, but my suspicion is that's more likely to be to do with ideas about physical control, gesture. If you think about the Roman Empire and all of the work done on gesture and oration and social status, my suspicion is that it's more to do with social status and displays of social standing, which again is an animal thing, because of course social status, which affects the hormones and your mental well-being and all sorts of things, you know, anything that will convey, well, I'm an important person and you should take me seriously, it all still follows from being a kind of hierarchical primate, but it comes in these kind of wonderful various ways that human beings do it. My suspicion that's probably more to do with status than pathogen, but answers on a postcard on that one, because I don't know.
Thanks very much, Melanie. We're almost coming to the end. We've got a few more minutes, but I want to end on this loveliness of being animal and the intelligence that our bodies have. I'd love you to say, because your book ends that way, and I'd love you to say a few things about that. But just before that, you also say partway through your book that we are living through an age of extinction. And again, there's another topical word that, you know, has a movement with it and so on. And my question to you is, haven't we always lived through ages of extinction? That seems to be the way the world goes. Species come and go. Or is something special going on now?
Again, I mean, it's difficult to be brief on these, but I'll try. So firstly, perhaps to take on the last thing that you mentioned, the extinction issue. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is the fact that this has always mattered. It's always been a problem, you know, to think about what it means to be animal, and it is throughout, you know, it has been throughout recorded history. We've seen thinkers trying to make sense of this, from Aristotle through to whoever, you know, all across the world, in all cultures, have been trying to make sense of the human condition, and to understand what we are and what we're doing here. But so that's, you know, that's always been there, but I think the reason this has particular urgency now, that we actually start to really think about this critically and try and make better sense of what it means to pass an animal life, is partly because we have become an animal that is causing this mass extinction. Now, I've worked on extinction for years and years, and yes, it is, and I hear that back often, you know, but extinction is natural. It is natural, and as is death, as is impermanence. You know, human beings will go extinct eventually. You know, we can't sort of think in those sorts of terms about whether extinction is bad or not. You know, we have to approach this really from the fact, as I said earlier, that we are moral creatures, and the moral scale cannot be at the cosmic scale or even at the planetary scale, because it just becomes nonsensical. It has to happen at a much smaller time scale. So we have to make sense of what extinction means for us now, not what it meant in the Cretaceous, not what it means when there's an asteroid. What does it mean now for us as beings to knowingly be causing the collapse of life on Earth? A lot of people focus on just what it means for us. So we destroy our ecosystem, we don't have any pollinators, we will die too. That of course matters, but I personally am much more interested in the more difficult, but I think ultimately more nourishing moral and philosophical consequence of what it means to be the destroyer of life on the Earth. So I think trying to make sense of what it means to be animal, how it matters, intersects very strongly with how we make sense of that and square up to the challenge of causing the sixth mass extinction. So that's what I would say. There's obviously a lot more to say about that, but that's what I would say about that. And then we have this other big shift now, which is that, you know, in many ways, the extinction crisis that we're going through, humans have always driven other species to extinction, probably pre-Homo sapiens, actually. You know, as upright, super brainy hominins, we've been taking out mammals, certainly. Sorry, I'm going a bit bleached out because the gorgeous sun has come out in Cornwall here. But we, the kind of really accelerated extinction rate that we have now is really a consequence of the first and second industrial revolutions. And yet we're so focused on trying to fix the mess that we've created from the industrial revolutions, and obviously lots of great things came from the industrial revolution too, but there have been very negative consequences, as is always the case with industrial history. But we now have a fourth industrial revolution. So and this is involving, so this is CRISPR-Cas9, for instance, this is gene editing, genome editing, AI, you know, synthetic biology. We have new, quite a staggering technologies that we don't fully understand yet and can't fully steer yet, but involve being able to sort of industrialize and do you know, exploit at the level of the biology, at the level of cells and genes and so forth. We really haven't got to grips with what that means for us as a society. We certainly don't understand it well enough, and we are certainly not fairly or openly deliberating it at the moment. And so why that matters is, you imagine what it means to have the ability to change a genome, to create a whole new organism in a lab, for instance, actually release that organism into an ecosystem to fulfill some sort of human chosen goal, to consider whether or not we could extend our lifespans, to consider whether we could extend who and how we can have children, what we want to select or deselect from our embryos. These aren't science fiction. These are real things that are happening now, that we're not that are happening in labs, but that we have on the horizon to consider and talk about application. My great concern is, if we haven't answered all of this stuff we've been talking about, if we don't know what it means, and we don't even like being animals, or we fear being animals, there are certain things that we hide away. I would say, for instance, the business of having babies, you know, how it matters in the 0 to 3 years of life, how the womb matters to our development, all of these sorts of things. If we've sort of pushed all of that away and not thought about it, we are not likely to be good designers of future life. So that's so towards the end, I try to show us not only that it matters that we're animals, but to show us some of the incredible things that often we don't pay enough attention to. And one of those, for instance, are are, you know, the important early years of babies' lives, and touch and all of these sorts of things that we need to understand before we sort of edit them out in a future scenario. So yeah, that's what that's really all about.
Well, you're being very much like a scientist now in that answer. Terrific. More questions and answers arise from the question, from the answer. But if you, in the 1 minute and 12 seconds that we have left, if you could say a few words about a lovely thing that you say at the end, that our bodies have an intelligence that we need. You don't say our minds, you don't say our intellect, you actually say it twice. Our bodies have an intelligence. What's that, Melanie?
Well, COVID is the place to look for that, you know, straight away. So, you know, it's great that we've got this technology. It's great that we've got incredible that we've got, you know, we focus so much on the science. It is all incredible. We forget that actually you talk to a doctor in critical care and they will tell you that a lot of what they are doing is supporting our immune systems. So they're just trying to keep us going long enough for our immune systems to kick in and do the job. Because our immune systems, our bodies are absolutely, you know, we're not just this brain, some, you know, spiritual brain hidden, you know, that can separate, that we can separate out from all of our bodies. Our bodies are, you know, have gone through millions of years of adaptation. They have an incredible intelligence baked in. So our immune systems can recognize something that's entered into our body that isn't us. You stop and think about that. That's quite incredible at a molecular level to be able to recognize an intruder within your body, to then rally a response to eliminate it, and most often get rid of it. You know, we're living in this kind of sanitized age, but actually human beings interact with pathogens all the time, and most of the time our bodies deal with it. I'm not advocating, I should be quite clear, I'm not advocating a naturalist approach to healthcare. I'm totally pro all kinds of technological healthcare, but my point is that our bodies are doing this incredible work, and we forget it, and we don't support them in doing that as much as we should do with the foods that we eat, the ways that we live. We're learning a lot now about the gut bacteria and supporting gut health and how that affects the whole body, including our identity and sense of mind, depression, experience of reality. So that's one thing, but there's another part of it as well, which is, as I was saying earlier, we're social creatures. So the ability to support our immune systems by cuddling one another, for instance, and releasing this cascade of hormones that get us on the right track again. That's a deeply animal and deeply beautiful thing. So that's what I really talk about.
Which alas, we can't do online, cuddle one another, look after one another. And I hope you say something like that in order for our bodies to look after us, we have to look after our bodies, and something like that. I mean, this is a book, listeners and viewers, this is a book on which I made pages of notes. I've nicked lots of pages. At every mealtime in my house, I wanted to say to my family, listen to this. What do you think of this? This is a great book for starting conversations that you may not be able to finish. But alas, we have to stop now. I hope there will be many people who will watch this. Melanie Challenger, the Swindon Festival of Literature, says, many thanks for coming to us with this book.
Oh, it's been my pleasure to be here. And it is supposed to get people thinking and talking. That's the hope.